Hey there, my name is Alex or Mont, and this is my review of Resident Evil Revelations 2 for the PC. All of the footage in this video will be from raid mode, as to prevent any campaign spoilers, although there will be many comparisons to prior games in the franchise, mostly 5 and 6. So, a quick version of this review. I enjoyed Revelations 2 quite a lot, but at times the game feels cheap from a production perspective. With that out of the way, let's go into some more detail. Revelations 2, despite its name, does not seem to be a direct sequel to the first Revelations, but rather a continuation in the same vein. The Revelations series has a lower budget than the main entries of the Resident Evil franchise, and it shows at times. But this lower budget also means they don't have to appeal, they don't have to try to appeal to as many people as possible. Is it a survival horror game? Perhaps, but it kind of depends on what you define survival horror as. I wouldn't strictly say it is. There is plenty of action, and there are plenty of guns, and at least on the normal difficulty setting, enough ammo. Even if at times you will find yourself running scarce and making every shot count. So is there more of an emphasis on horror and survival elements when it comes to the story? Arguably so, as the main objective of the campaign is largely to survive and escape, much as it was during Resident Evil 1 and 2, whereas 5 and 6, they move towards more traditional action, wherein your objective is more offensively biased. In Resident Evil 1, it's all about escaping the mansion. In Resident Evil 5, it's more like go into the mansion and blow it up kind of thing. If you are looking for classic Resident Evil, I don't believe you'll find it here. If classic Resident Evil to you is, 1, 2, 3, Code Veronica and whatever. Although that does seem to be something that people cannot agree on. What is classic Resident Evil? Some people say Code Veronica is where it started to become all over the top. But if you are a fan of the Resident Evil franchise in general, including the more recent games, I think you would enjoy Revelations 2. There are plenty of nods and little in-jokes that fans are sure to appreciate. But even if you've never played a Resident Evil game before, it doesn't alienate new players by expecting them to understand everything that's going on. That is one problem that Resident Evil 6 had, and even as a fan of the franchise, 6 was a bit confusing to me. The basic premise for Revelations 2 is that Claire Redfield and Moira Burton have been kidnapped, and awake to find themselves on a strange island from which they must escape. The other side of the story revolves around Barry Burton following a distress signal and arriving at the island to rescue his daughter, Moira, discovering a lost little girl upon the way. Now, just to briefly mention, I'm a big fan of Resident Evil 5 and 6, and I really enjoyed both of them. I've also played Resident Evil 4 and 0, but only snippets of 1 and 2, and nothing of Code Veronica and any other games in the franchise. Although now that 1 is out on Steam, I should probably change that. But my chief interest in the games has largely been just because I wanted a good co-op game to play, and 5 fit the bill perfectly. That said, I enjoyed Revelations 2 quite a lot. But first I'm going to talk about the bad parts of the game, the parts of the game that I didn't like. Chief amongst those is the lack of online co-op. Considering the nature of the game, I see no reason as to why online co-op has been left out. One might argue that considering only one character is able to use firearms, the other might get bored, but I don't feel that would have been the case. On the contrary, I feel like having a co-op experience wherein both players have unique skills would be quite a new experience in a third-person shooter. And that actually leads nicely into my next point, the AI partner. During Barry's campaign, I rarely ran into trouble thanks to Natalia's AI, as many enemies seem programmed to largely ignore her. Some have unique attacks that they will do to Barry, and only to Barry, and they're far too gruesome to do to a little girl, a fact that you can actually abuse to a certain extent. As a matter of fact, if you die as Barry, the classic "you died" screen appears. If you die as Natalia, it just says, "you fainted." Even if you jump off an 100-foot ledge and fall off a cliff, it will apparently only make you faint. But that said, Claire's campaign has, well, I often ran into trouble because Moira's AI would just stand around letting the enemies hit her, and sometimes you will run away from an enemy, and she will be running after you, behind the enemy, who then might decide to turn around and like smack you in the face. Perhaps the idea is that you constantly swap around, using Moira to stun the enemies and such, but I often found myself frustrated at her AI all the same. If you've played Resident Evil 5 in single player, you'll no doubt remember the frustrations of having Sheva, allowing herself to be pummeled and then wasting your herbs and your ammo. If you're going to play Revelations 2, I would strongly suggest utilising the local co-op, especially if you're playing on a higher difficulty setting. One small advantage to playing by yourself, however, is that Natalia and Moira seem to regenerate health when you aren't playing as them, to somewhat alleviate the stress of Moira getting blown up by everything. And once again, that point leads into my next, the performance of the game. Whilst I've not had the chance to play the game in split screen, I've heard that the performance doesn't take too much of a hit, and this is a game that runs at 60 frames per second on PC, Xbox and PS4, or at least they all aim for 60 frames per second. That said, the game isn't really optimised all that well on PC. Initially I ran into a horrible juddery animation sort of glitch and very big frame rate hits, especially during sequences featuring a lot of particle effects or large open areas. Several patches have improved it, and it is by no means game breaking, but it's still a disappointment to see, especially after Resident Evil 5 and 6, both of which run superbly, and both of which feature nicer visuals than Revelations 2 in my opinion, and that comes largely from the much higher quality lighting. Which, of course, leads into my next point, the feel of the game, which can be very cheap at times. Even if you do not appreciate Resident Evil 5 and 6 for their strange plots and overemphasis on action, the games are high budget and high quality. Both games feature extremely high quality lighting effects and detailed character models and animations. A lot of time and work went into both, and both were some of the best looking games when they came out, and both still hold up well on PC and look nice. Revelations 2 looks okay, it looks fine. Sometimes it looks nice, sometimes it looks ugly. Most of the time it just looks normal. There are perhaps one or two moments wherein you'll want to stop and take in the surroundings, but largely the environments are bland and uninteresting, and nothing about the graphics stands out, which is of particular issue when the game doesn't actually perform that well either. It is very easy to forgive a game that has a few frame rate issues if it looks amazing, for example. But this, well, it doesn't, and it still has frame rate issues. It's not a huge problem, but it does make the game feel cheap or low budget at times. Likewise with the game's animations, if you're playing as Claire you are unlikely to notice anything wrong, but when you play as Barry or another male character in raid mode, it becomes quite obvious, at least to me. They seem to sort of share some of Claire's animations, so they don't really have the pacing, the striding of a male character. They sort of hold themselves a bit like a female, which it just looks a bit weird to me. Because back in Resident Evil 5, the animations were fantastic. Chris is a huge person, and he feels like he has suitable weight to his actions, whereas the much smaller Sheva is animated to reflect that. But in Revelations 2, Barry, a rather large man in his early 50s by now I believe, is animated near identically to Claire. As I said, it isn't really an issue, but if you have, like me, enjoyed the really good animations of 4, 5 and 6, you might be disappointed from that perspective, and at least for me it was quite immersion breaking. But that about covers it for my complaints, so let's move on to the positive side of things. First up, gameplay. Revelations 2 for the most part feels like a nice evolution of Resident Evil 5 and 6. One of the most common complaints of those games that I've heard, beyond the "oh, it's too action-based," is how they control. 5 in particular feels very strange to most people who pick it up, and even to me. I played the demo of 5 before the game came out, and I didn't like it at all, but when I actually played the game and got into it, it wasn't so much of an issue. And whilst in Resident Evil 6 you can move and shoot, a lot of the controls seem unintuitive. Indeed, both games have quite a steep learning curve to their controls. Are they bad controls? No, but they are not intuitive. I mean, even when I went back to playing Resident Evil 6 after maybe a year or so, of not playing it, I couldn't remember the controls and it took me a hell of a long time to get used to them again. Revelations 2 plays quite like 6, but streamlined. You no longer need to manage a bizarre herb and pill system. You just pick up herbs and then you use them with the right bumper, or R1, or whatever. The evasion mechanics, on the other hand, have been either streamlined or dumbed down, depending on your perspective. In terms of practicality though, Revelations 2 features a simple but very effective evasion mechanic. If you press the dodge button along with a direction, you will perform a quick dodge in that direction. Simple and effective, and probably second nature to those of you who have been playing Souls or Bloodborne. The knife too is much easier to use, where in 5 you had to ready the knife with one button and attack with another. In Revelations 2 a simple hit of the trigger will swipe with your knife. Although as I said, the evasion mechanics are somewhat dumbed down. You can no longer go prone and like go on the floor and crawl around and all that stuff, which whilst probably most people never used it in Resident Evil 6, it was still pretty useful. Meanwhile, the gunplay is satisfying, even if the guns are not animated with quite the level of detail as previous games. Nor do they have quite the same quality of sound, it seems to me, but they're still good. The reload animations are still pretty nice. The melee and gun system that Resident Evil 4 introduced is still at play here. Stun an enemy with a headshot and you can follow up with a devastating melee attack. Unfortunately, there's only one real melee attack per character, and some characters actually share melee attacks. Like, as far as I'm aware, Moira, Claire, and another character who I'm not going to mention, they all share the same, like, roundhouse kick, which is disappointing, because in Resident Evil 5 everyone had unique attacks. As a matter of fact, the melee and gun system of 4 and 5 was actually probably my favourite aspect of those games. But you might argue that why would you need any other melee attack beyond the one from a head stun, as that was generally the most effective one, save for the leg stun, one hit kills and all that stuff. In place of different melee attacks, you can unlock a skill that allows you to charge up your melee attack, which, whilst effective, looks very silly. Still, I would have liked to see characters having more variety to their melee attacks. I don't see why Claire and Moira have to have the exact same kick, for example. It's just a recycled animation, I suppose, which again, is part of the budgetary issues. There's a skill system and it's quite nice, but during the campaign it feels rather more like an afterthought than a real game changer, whereas the skills have more of an impact during the raid mode. Mechanically speaking, the gameplay in Revelations is sound, so how about the story? Personally, I found the story refreshing. There are plenty of games wherein the fate of the world hangs in the balance and it's up to you to save it, so having a game with a more personal, intimate story is something that I can get behind. The characters are not particularly well written, but they play their roles well. Claire is perhaps the least interesting of the bunch, despite being the series veteran here. She has little insight to offer and next to no development as a character. Moira and Barry have a dynamic to them that is slowly revealed as you play, and Natalia plays an important role and likewise has some nice interactions with Barry. Which begs the question, why is Claire here at all? Is she just to appease fans who haven't seen her for a while? Maybe. I can't help but think Rebecca Chambers from Resident Evil 0, and Resident Evil 1 I guess, would have made a more interesting choice, but then I'm probably a little biased there. That said, Claire is the mature, strong anchor to which the scared Moira might cling. All the same, I did not find Claire interesting, but perhaps she's just there for the player to project themselves onto, the representation of the player. The plot and setting of Revelations 2 are nothing to go crazy over, but there's plenty of classic Resident Evil twists and bizarre monologues, including an appearance by a certain character that at least a few of us have been interested in for quite some time. The island itself has quite a story to it that is revealed during logs that you might find whilst exploring. I didn't care too much for it personally, but that's not to say that there's anything wrong with it. The island itself does convey a kind of bleak beauty at times, which is very fitting, and there are multiple endings and the game does seem to set itself up for a sequel in some ways. The next line is a bit of a spoiler, but I'm going to briefly explain how you get the two different endings. Essentially, at the end of chapter 3 during the boss fight, You have a choice of which character to use in the QuickTime event. If you use Claire, you get one ending. If you use Moira, you get the other ending. That is, as far as I'm aware, the only thing that seems to determine which ending you get. What about the gameplay split then? You will find more action than puzzles, but roughly equal parts action and exploration. Although episode 3 is quite puzzle heavy, and I expect episode 3 in general will be a fan favourite of the 4 episodes. You will find puzzles here and there, although none of them are too hard, and at least one of them was rather satisfying to solve. There are also extended segments featuring no combat or enemies whatsoever, which can be nice to build atmosphere. And speaking of the enemies, how are the enemies? Your standard Resident Evil affair. You got zombies, dogs, insects, exploding enemies, and bosses that can soak up ridiculous amounts of damage. So you'd best be saving that magnum ammo. None of the bosses really stood out to me as being fun or exciting or really offering anything new, but neither did any of them really feel cheap to me. Barry will encounter a certain enemy that I can see people either loving or hating, because it's invisible. The only way to figure out its location is by listening to your partner's directions and adjusting your aim accordingly. If you miss, she will go to the left, to the right, up, down, there it is. It's kind of bizarre, but interesting. I liked it. And what about length and replayability? I do not think I'd want to revisit the campaign all that much, and the running time will vary in accordance to your playstyle. If you play stealthy and avoid enemies, you'll take longer, and if you spend a lot of time exploring and figuring out puzzles, your playtime will likewise grow. Each episode felt about right to me at around 2 hours per episode, roughly speaking, but even if you play very slowly, I think you'll finish the entire game in around 8 hours, not including the 2 bonus chapters of course. Both of which take rather drastic changes to the feel of the game. For example, one of them has like no combat whatsoever and it's entirely stealth based. Although there is some incentive to replay the campaign for collectibles and such rewards, the bulk of the replay value comes from Raid Mode, a score-based survival mode that returns from the first Revelations, and replaces the Mercenaries mode from 4, 5 and 6. Like Mercenaries, Raid Mode it's very addictive, but unlike Mercs, it's quite RPG heavy in a sense. Your characters and enemies have levels at which determine damage dealt and received. Numbers pop up every time you shoot an enemy, and you can obtain new skills, both active and passive, for your character, and as with Mercenaries you can unlock new characters and so forth. You also get guns that you can equip with parts, just like in the campaign mode, and although the campaign mode had a crafting mode, I didn't really talk about it much because it's not all that interesting. The crafting is largely absent from Raid, aside from gun customization. And these parts can make your guns quite ridiculous. Have you ever seen a sniper rifle that shoots bullets that are about as large as a dog? Well, you can in theory do that because there is something that you can equip to weapons which makes the bullets have a larger hit radius, and if you get to the high levels of that, your bullets suddenly become enormous, and it's kinda silly. Raid mode is quite frankly ridiculous and not serious at all. You can make characters dance to damage enemies, you can make them do really stupid gestures, you can shoot out Dragon Ball Z style shockwaves to send enemies flying, and unlike campaign mode, Raid features online co-op, although as of right now, there is still no online co-op for the PC version. That's apparently coming at the end of March. Raid mode features dozens and dozens of missions. Around 100, I believe, so if you enjoy it, you'll likely be able to get a hell of a lot of hours out of it, let's just say. I know I got hundreds of hours out of Mercenaries in Resident Evil 5, and that didn't even really have any reason to keep playing, as once you've unlocked all the characters, which you can do in a day, you don't really progress in any way, you're just doing it because it's fun. Whereas every mission in Raid mode gets you gold, experience, the chance of earning some new weapon, new parts to put on your weapons, new skills, and there are also daily missions that reward you for coming back to play again and again, and I believe you can like do some weird stuff where you sign up and like upload data to the website and then you can get things on the website, like unlock things and send them into the game. There's a lot of replay value with Raid mode. So that's Revelations 2. All in all, an enjoyable experience, even if at times it feels cheaper compared to the main entries. But at the same time, even though it is less action oriented, this is still a game with a lot of gunplay involved. And if you're playing it with the intention to get scared, I think you might be disappointed. I think there were 2 jump scares in the whole game, so even if you like jump scares, you're not gonna get a lot of those. It's a good game though, in my opinion. But is it a good Resident Evil game? That depends on what you like about Resident Evil. Ultimately, if you like 4, 5 and 6, you'll probably enjoy this. And even if you didn't like their heavy approach to action, you might like this somewhat more restrained approach. As for me, I'm waiting on Resident Evil 7, which I hope will be high budget, high quality, and provide a fun co-op experience wherein I can punch a hell of a lot of zombies.
Get over here!